$10,000 in cold hard cash sat on the announcer's table. On one side, a multi-million-dollar dealership owner and his factory-tuned behemoth. On the other, an old man, an $800 scrapyard Farmall, and 90 seconds that would forever humiliate the proudest man in Darkwood County. The Darkwood County Fair always smelled of three distinct things by late August: deep-fried funnel cakes, livestock, and the sharp metallic tang of unburnt diesel fuel. For generations, the Saturday night tractor pull was the undisputed crown jewel of the week. It was a place where local farmers settled quiet grudges, where mechanical ingenuity was tested against raw earth, and where for the last 5 years, William Abernathy made a point to remind everyone exactly who owned them. William Abernathy was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. As the sole proprietor of Abernathy Ag and Equipment, the largest John Deere dealership within a 300-mile radius, he held the financial leashes of half the county. If a farmer needed a combine fixed during the peak of harvest, they had to go through William. If they needed financing for a new seeder, William held the pen. He was a corporate shark swimming in a pond of blue-collar minnows, and he loved nothing more than showing off his teeth. Every year, William brought a demonstration model to the fair's unlimited heavyweight class. This year, it was a brand new John Deere 8R410. But this wasn't the machine you bought off the lot. William had his master technicians pull it into the back bays of his dealership for weeks, stripping the emissions limiters, dialing up the fuel rail pressure, and tweaking the engine control unit until the massive 9.0-liter PowerTech engine was churning out north of 600 horsepower. It was an intimidating piece of modern engineering, a towering beast of immaculate green and yellow, wrapped in aggressive deep-tread duals and polished until the floodlights mirrored off its hood. William didn't just want to win the pull. He wanted to demoralize the competition. He wanted every farmer sitting in those aluminum bleachers to look at their aging, greasy tractors, feel a profound sense of inadequacy, and walk into his showroom on Monday morning, ready to sign their lives away on a 10-year financing plan. Across the fairgrounds, far away from the blinding halogen lights of William's sponsored pit area, sat Silas Miller. Silas was everything William was not. At 68 years old, his hands were mapped with the scars of a lifetime spent fighting rusted bolts and stubborn earth. He worked a modest 400-acre spread on the rocky east side of the county, a farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Silas was a quiet man, the kind who spoke softly and let his work do the shouting. But this year, the county had noticed something strange happening out at the Miller place. It started back in April when Silas attended an estate auction for the late Nora Wilson. Nora's husband had passed away a decade prior, leaving behind a collapsed barn full of junk. Among the rotted timber and rusted corrugated tin was a 1948 Farmall M. It was a tragic sight. The tires were dry rotted and flat. The iconic tricycle front end was buried in mud, and the faded red paint had oxidized into a chalky rust-mottled pink. It hadn't run since the Clinton administration. When the auctioneer reached the tractor, the crowd of local farmers chuckled. It was scrap metal, but Silas Miller raised his hand. $800, Silas had said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. William Abernathy, who had been at the auction, looking to scoop up the Wilson land for pennies on the dollar, had laughed out loud. "You buying a lawn ornament, Silas? Or did you finally go senile?" Silas hadn't responded. He just paid the clerk in cash, winched the sad dead Farmall onto his flatbed, and drove it home. For the next 4 months, the lights in Silas Miller's machine shed burned until 3 in the morning. Deliveries from out-of-state performance shops, unmarked cardboard boxes, heavy with machine steel, arrived at his gate, raising the eyebrows of the local postal worker. Billy Jensen, a 19-year-old gearhead who worked part-time at the local auto parts store, swore he heard a sound coming from Silas's farm in late July that sounded less like a vintage tractor and more like a fighter jet breaking the sound barrier. But whenever anyone asked Silas what he was doing with the $800 rust bucket, he simply smiled, tipped his worn Stetson, and changed the subject. Now under the humid, dusty sky of the Darkwood County Fair, the Farmall M was parked in the shadows at the very edge of the staging lanes. To the untrained eye, it still looked like a scrapyard refugee. Silas hadn't bothered to paint it. The hood still bore the faded chalky patina of a machine left to die. But if you looked closely, if you really knew what you were looking at, there were signs. The rear tires were brand new, custom-cut pulling slicks that looked suspiciously wide. The frame had been subtly boxed and reinforced with thick steel plates welded with dimes so perfect they looked like they were laid by a machine. And protruding from the hood was a stark, straight chrome exhaust pipe that looked entirely too large for a standard 4-cylinder gas engine. The battle lines were drawn, the corporate giant with his 6-figure factory monster, and the quiet farmer with his $800 ghost. The bleachers were packed to capacity, the air thick with anticipation-stale beer, and the electric hum of the PA system. The unlimited heavyweight class was about to begin, and Darkwood County was about to witness a massacre. They just didn't know who the victim was going to be. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for the reigning king of the dirt," roared Tom Higgins, the fair's longtime announcer, his voice echoing through the crackling stadium speakers. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and reluctant applause as William Abernathy backed his colossal John Deere 8R410 toward the weight sled. The tractor was a spectacle. The LED light bars mounted to the cab blinded anyone staring directly at it, and the deep, throaty idle of the tuned diesel engine vibrated right through the soles of the spectators' boots. The mechanics of a tractor pull are simple but brutally unforgiving. A tractor hooks up to a mechanical sled known as the transfer box. As the tractor pulls the sled down the 300-foot dirt track, a heavy weight box mechanically slides forward, transferring massive amounts of friction to the ground. It goes from dragging a heavy box to trying to pull a brick wall. The goal is a full pull, dragging the sled the entire length of the track. Williams' crew chief, a sneering man in a spotless Abernathy equipment polo shirt, dropped the heavy steel pin into the sled's hitch. Williams, sitting high in the air-conditioned, leather-upholstered cab, didn't even look back. He gave a thumbs up out the window, a smug grin plastered across his face. The green flag dropped. William hammered the throttle. The John Deere screamed, a massive plume of thick black diesel smoke erupting from the stack. The massive dual tires dug into the compacted clay, launching the tractor and the massive sled forward with terrifying ease. The weight box crawled forward on the sled, but the 8R didn't even flinch. At the 150-foot mark, where lesser tractors bogged down and died, Williams' machine just dug deeper. The engine roared, a deafening testament to hundreds of thousands of dollars of modern engineering. He blew past the 200-foot mark, then 250, At 290 feet, the engine finally began to lug the tires, spinning violently and kicking up a massive rooster tail of dirt. But the momentum was too great. The John Deere crossed the 300-foot line to a chaotic roar from the crowd. A flawless full pull. William killed the engine, stepped out of the cab, and stood on the tire, raising both hands in victory, like a conquering gladiator. He climbed down, strutted over to the announcer's stand, and aggressively motioned for Tom Higgins to hand over the microphone. Tom, looking a bit nervous, obliged. "That right there," William's voice boomed over the PA, dripping with condescension, "is what real power looks like. That's what happens when you stop playing with antiques and invest in the best equipment in the world. But I know some of you boys still think you're mechanics. I know some of you think your grandpa's junk can compete with Abernathy engineering." The crowd went dead silent. This was off script. William reached into his tailored denim jacket and pulled out a thick banded stack of $100 bills. He slammed the brick of cash onto the announcer's table with a dull thud. $10,000, William barked into the mic, pointing at the cash. "I'm putting 10 grand of my own money right here, right now. I challenge any man, woman, or child in this county to hook up to that sled. I'll even have them load an extra 2,000 pounds onto the box. You beat my distance in 90 seconds or less, you walk away with the cash. You lose, you publicly admit over this microphone that Abernathy Equipment is the undisputed king of this county." A low murmur rippled through the bleachers. $10,000 was a staggering amount of money. For many farmers in Darkwood, that was the difference between keeping the farm and facing foreclosure. But it was a suicide run. The sled was already heavily weighted for the unlimited class. Adding another 2,000 pounds made it a brick wall. Hooking a standard farm tractor to that sled wouldn't just result in a loss. It would likely snap axles, blow head gaskets, and destroy drivetrains. "Nobody," William mocked, leaning against the table, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "That's what I thought. Just a bunch of talkers. I'll take that action." The voice didn't come through the PA system, but it carried perfectly through the sudden tense silence of the arena. Heads swiveled toward the dark staging lanes. A rusty, faded red nose poked out from the shadows. The engine sputtered a hollow, irregular pop, pop, pop that sounded like it was running on 3 cylinders and pure luck. It was Silas Miller. He drove the 1948 Farmall M slowly into the harsh glare of the arena lights. The contrast was comical. Sitting next to the towering modern John Deere, the old Farmall looked like a child's toy left out in the rain. The crowd erupted into laughter. Even a few of Silas's friends shook their heads, burying their faces in their hands. William Abernathy grabbed the mic, laughing so hard he had to catch his breath. "Silas, you've finally lost your damn mind. You're going to hook Nora Wilson's scrap metal to the heavyweight sled. You'll snap the chassis in half before you move it 5 feet. Silas idled the sputtering Farmall to a stop near the announcer's table. He calmly shifted into neutral, set the brake, and climbed down from the rusted iron seat. He walked up to the table, ignoring William completely. From the breast pocket of his faded flannel shirt, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it out and laid it right next to William's stack of cash. Tom Higgins leaned over to look at it. His eyes widened. "Good Lord, Silas, is this real cashier's check from Darkwood First National?" Silas said quietly, his voice steady. $10,000 drawn against the equity of my farm. If we're betting William, we're doing it right. My 10,000 against yours." The laughter in the crowd died instantly. A heavy, suffocating tension fell over the fairgrounds. Silas had just bet the farm literally on an $800 piece of junk. William's smile vanished, replaced by a dark, angry scowl. He looked at the cashier's check, then at Silas, and finally at the sad-looking Farmall sputtering nearby. He felt a brief flicker of hesitation. Silas wasn't a stupid man, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. It was physically impossible for that machine to pull the weighted sled. Physics simply wouldn't allow it. "You're a fool, old man," William hissed, stepping close to Silas. "I'm going to take your money, and I'm going to frame that check in my dealership lobby." "Put the extra 2,000 pounds on the sled, William," Silas replied, not breaking eye contact. "And start the clock." William waved aggressively to the track officials. "Load it up. Load the extra weight. Let's get this over with." As the track crew used a forklift to drop heavy iron blocks onto the sled, the crowd watched in stunned silence. Billy Jensen, the young mechanic, pushed his way to the front row of the bleachers, his eyes locked onto the Farmall. He watched as Silas walked back to the tractor. Silas didn't climb back into the seat immediately. Instead, he reached down to the side of the engine cowling. He flipped two hidden toggle switches mounted behind the steering column. The irregular sputtering pop, pop, pop of the engine abruptly stopped. For a split second, there was silence. Then a new sound began. It didn't sound like a tractor. It was a high-pitched metallic whine that began to build, accompanied by a deep, guttural thrum that seemed to vibrate the very air in the arena. The heavy chrome exhaust stack on the hood suddenly spat a sharp lick of blue flame. Billy Jensen grabbed the chain-link fence, his knuckles turning white. He recognized that sound. It wasn't the sound of an old gas engine. It was the terrifying spooling shriek of a compound turbocharger set up force-feeding air into a heavily modified high-displacement diesel block that Silas had somehow wedged and disguised under the narrow rusted hood of the Farmall. Silas climbed into the iron seat, pulled his worn Stetson down tight over his eyes, and looked out at the 300 feet of dirt that was about to make history. The track crew chief, a burly man named Harlan Brooks, who had been hooking tractors to the Darkwood sled for 20 years, hesitated as he approached the back of the Farmall M. The air around the tractor felt wrong. It was hot, shimmering with a violent heat haze that distorted the floodlights, and the smell wasn't the sweet, rich scent of old gasoline. It was the sharp, acrid sting of burnt diesel and something chemical, something that made Harlan's eyes water. He leaned down, grabbing the massive steel ring of the sled, and hoisted it toward the Farmall's drawbar. Harlan froze. A standard Farmall M drawbar was a relatively thin piece of cast steel, perfectly adequate for pulling a two-bottom plow through loose topsoil. What he was looking at was a massive 2-inch thick slab of billet steel anchored directly to the rear axle housings with heavy, reinforced gussets. It was the kind of hitch you found on a freight train. Harlan dropped the heavy steel pin into place, feeling a sudden, inexplicable tremor vibrate up his arm from the tractor's chassis. He backed away quickly, raising his hands to signal a clean hook. Up in the announcer's booth, Tom Higgins wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at the giant digital stopwatch mounted above the track. "All right, folks, the wager is set. The extra 2,000 pounds of dead weight has been dropped into the transfer box. Silas Miller has exactly 90 seconds to drag this monstrosity 300 feet. If he doesn't, William Abernathy walks away with the deed to the Miller farm." Down on the track, the green flag raised. Silas Miller sat perfectly still in the rusted iron bucket seat. He didn't look at William. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were locked dead ahead on the white chalk line marking the 300-foot boundary. His calloused right hand rested on a heavy custom-machined throttle lever that had replaced the original factory quadrant. His left foot hovered over the clutch pedal. Underneath the chalky, oxidized hood of the old Farmall, a monster was waiting to be unleashed. Silas hadn't just rebuilt the tractor, he had hollowed it out and resurrected it around a legendary power plant. Wedged between the reinforced frame rails was an International DT-466 inline-six diesel engine salvaged from a wrecked heavy-duty dump truck. But it was far from stock. Silas had spent every night for 4 months machining custom fire rings for the cylinder head to keep the head gasket from blowing out under extreme pressure. He had swapped the factory pistons for forged steel, installed a massive high-flow mechanical fuel injection pump, and topped it all off with a compound turbocharger setup, a smaller turbo feeding pressurized air into an absolutely massive primary turbo. It was a combination designed to do one thing, produce the earth-shattering torque. The flagman chopped the green flag down. The 90-second clock began to tick. 0001, 0002. Silas didn't just dump the clutch. That would have snapped the transmission input shaft like a dry twig. Instead, he smoothly pushed the custom throttle lever forward while meticulously feathering the clutch pedal. The sound that erupted from the single chrome stack was catastrophic. It wasn't a roar, it was a physical force. The deep concussive thud, thud, thud of the massive diesel cylinders, firing under heavy load, echoed off the aluminum bleachers, rattling the fillings in the spectators' teeth. Immediately following it was the high-pitched, agonizing shriek of the twin turbos spooling up to 60 pounds of boost. A thick, opaque column of black smoke violently blasted toward the night sky. 0006, 0007. The massive custom-cut pulling slicks on the rear of the Farmall bit into the compacted clay. The tires wrinkled, folding over themselves as the raw rotational force fought against the immense dead weight of the sled. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing moved. The tractor strained the chassis, groaning in protest. The rusted front tricycle tires lifted 6 inches off the dirt, hovering in the air. Then the sled lurched. 0012, 0013. The crowd let out a collective gasp. It was moving. The Farmall was dragging the heavily weighted sled forward. It wasn't the smooth, effortless launch of William's modern John Deere. It was violent. It was brutal. The old red tractor shuddered and shook the front end, violently bouncing in the air as the tires dug trenches into the earth. "Look at it go!" screamed Billy Jensen from the front row, his hands gripping the chain-link fence so hard his fingers ached. "He's got a DT-466 in there. The crazy old man actually fit a 466 in a Farmall." Up by the announcer's table, William Abernathy's smug smile faltered. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "It's a trick," he muttered to his crew chief. "He's going to blow the transmission in another 30 feet. That old iron can't handle the torque. But Silas Miller wasn't relying on old iron. Behind the DT466 engine was a custom-built multi-disc heavy-duty clutch mated to a completely custom machine driveline, built with planetary gears salvaged from a piece of heavy mining equipment. It was designed to withstand a bomb blast. 0025, 0026. The Farmall crossed the 100-foot mark. The weight box on the sled began its relentless mechanical slide forward, shifting the mass directly over the friction pan. The resistance increased exponentially with every inch. Silas pushed the throttle lever further. The pitch of the engine shifted from a concussive thud to a terrifying metallic scream. A 2-foot jet of blue flame erupted from the exhaust stack, illuminating the night sky. The sheer violence of the vibration was shaking the rust right off the hood, leaving a dusting of orange powder falling onto the dirt below. 0035, 0036. 150 feet. Halfway there. But the true test was just beginning. The weight box was now 3/4 of the way up the sled. The drag on the rear tires was monumental. The Farmall's forward momentum began to slow. The custom slicks spun faster desperately, searching for traction in the chewed-up clay. The front tires slammed back down to the earth as the tractor began to bog down under the immense load. Silas's hands were bone white on the steering wheel. He could feel the engine temperature skyrocketing, the heat radiating through the firewall and baking his legs. The RPMs were dropping. The engine was choking on the sheer weight of William Abernathy's arrogance. "He's dying," William yelled, a triumphant, cruel laugh escaping his lips. He pointed at the track. "I told you, physics always wins, Silas. You just lost your farm. 0048, 0049. At 180 feet, the Farmall came to a complete agonizing halt. The tires were still spinning, kicking up massive rooster tails of dirt that pelted the sled operator, but forward progress had stopped. The engine was lugging the deep, rhythmic thudding, slowing down. It was drowning. The digital clock glowed relentlessly. 50 seconds had passed. 40 remained. The crowd fell completely silent. The only sound in the entire county was the desperate dying roar of Silas Miller's engine. They were watching a man lose his legacy, his livelihood, and his family's land, all for a point of pride. Women looked away. Men took off their hats. It was over. But in the driver's seat, surrounded by deafening noise and blinding heat, Silas Miller wasn't panicked. He was waiting. He needed the turbochargers to be loaded to their absolute breaking point. He needed the engine right on the ragged edge of stalling. He glanced at the boost gauge mounted on the steering column. It was pegged at 85 psi. The exhaust gas temperature gauge was buried in the red, indicating the manifold was quite literally glowing hot enough to melt aluminum. It was time to play his final hand. 0055. 0056. With the tractor stationary and the engine suffocating under the 2-ton anchor, Silas Miller reached beneath the rusted seat and grabbed a heavy brass ball valve lever. This was the secret weapon that had arrived in those unmarked cardboard boxes, a high-pressure water methanol injection system. When an engine is pushed to the thermal limit, pumping more fuel will only melt the pistons. But injecting a highly atomized mist of water and methanol into the intake manifold instantly cools the pressurized air, creating a massive dense oxygen charge and a violent secondary detonation within the cylinders. It was the mechanical equivalent of injecting liquid adrenaline directly into a stopping heart. Silas yanked the brass lever back. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The dying lugging thud of the DT-466 engine vanished. In its place came a sound that defied description, a hollow, ear-splitting supersonic howl that forced people in the front row to physically cover their ears. The 2-foot lick of blue flame shooting from the exhaust stack instantly morphed into a 5-foot pillar of blinding white-hot fire. The massive secondary turbocharger spooled so hard it sounded like a jet engine ingesting a flock of birds. 0102, 0103. The Farmall didn't just start moving again, it violently vaulted forward. The rusted front end launched 3 feet into the air. The massive rear slicks, now superheated from the friction, bit into the hard-packed clay beneath the loose topsoil. The sheer instantaneous shock of the torque twist was so severe that the old oxidized hood of the Farmall buckled inward with a loud metallic crack, the structural integrity of the old tin failing under the torsional strain of the beast beneath it. The sled jerked forward with a sickening crunch. The heavy iron blocks William had added rattled violently against the steel retaining cage. 110, 111, 210 feet, 220 feet. William Abernathy's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the halogen lights. He backed away from the announcer's table, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. Stop him. The track is tearing up. Stop the run. Ass." But nobody was listening to William. The crowd had erupted into pure pandemonium. 3,000 people were on their feet, screaming at the top of their lungs, though their voices were completely swallowed by the deafening roar of Silas's machine. Beer was spilling, strangers were grabbing each other by the shoulders, and Billy Jensen was jumping up and down on the bleachers, tears of pure mechanical joy streaming down his face. 118, 119, 250 feet. 260 feet. The weight box was fully extended. The sled was a dead weight, grinding a massive polished trench into the dark wood dirt. The friction was so intense that sparks were shooting out from beneath the steel sled pan. But the old red tractor refused to die. Silas was completely engulfed in smoke and heat. The steering wheel was vibrating so violently it threatened to break his wrists, but he held on with a death grip, keeping the nose of the hovering tractor pointed straight and true. 0124, 0125, 280 feet, just 20 feet to go. The engine was screaming a high-frequency wail of stressed metal. The temperature gauge had completely shorted out. Silas knew he was on borrowed time. The custom fire rings were holding, but the head bolts were stretching. He could smell the sweet, sickly scent of vaporizing coolant. The engine was beginning to eat itself alive. "Come on, you old ghost," Silas gritted his teeth, his voice lost in the thunder. "Just a few more yards. Bring us home." 0128, 0129, 290 feet. William Abernathy grabbed his crew chief by the collar. "Do something," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "He's going to cross the line. There's nothing to do, boss." The crew chief yelled back, his own eyes wide with awe. He's pulling it. He's actually pulling it. 0132, 0133. The front wheels hovered, casting long, erratic shadows across the dirt. The exhaust stack glowed cherry red in the night. The massive slicks churned inch by agonizing inch, dragging the impossible weight forward. And then with a final shuddering heave, the nose of the rusted 1948 Farmall M broke the vertical plane of the white chalk line. A second later, the sled pan dragged across the 300-foot mark. 0136. Silas slammed his left foot down on the heavy clutch and shoved the throttle lever forward, instantly killing the water methanol feed. The engine revs dropped dramatically, returning to a heavy, exhausted, loping idle. The front wheels slammed down into the dirt with a heavy thud, kicking up a final cloud of dust. A full pull, with 2,000 extra pounds, in 86 seconds. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the arena, save for the heavy, rhythmic panting of the surviving diesel engine and the hissing of boiling coolant escaping from the overflow tube. Then Darkwood County exploded. It was a sound that dwarfed the engine. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated vindication. Hats were thrown into the air. People vaulted over the chain-link fences, rushing the track despite the protests of the security guards. They swarmed the rusted red tractor, a sea of cheering, weeping, ecstatic farmers who had just watched the undisputed tyrant of their county get absolutely humiliated by an old man and a scrapyard ghost. Up at the announcer's booth, Tom Higgins was laughing so hard he was crying. He picked up the microphone, his voice booming over the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, in 86 seconds with a full pull of 300 feet, the winner of the unlimited heavyweight class and the new owner of $20,000, Silas Miller. The dust over the Darkwood County track settled, but the roar of the crowd did not. Silas Miller sat motionless in the iron seat of the 1948 Farmall M, his chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly began to recede from his veins. Beneath him, the heavily modified DT 466 engine clicked and pinged as the superheated metal began to contract in the cool night air. The heavy chrome exhaust stack, now scorched a permanent iridescent blue, released a final lazy plume of gray smoke. Through the chaos of cheering farmers and flashing camera lenses, a figure violently shoved his way through the crowd. It was William Abernathy, his face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The veins in his neck were bulging against the collar of his expensive polo shirt. "You cheated!" William screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a trembling finger at Silas. He turned wildly toward Harlan Brooks, the track crew chief. "Disqualify him. Look at that thing. That's a heavy-duty truck engine. That's a compound turbo setup. That's not a Farmall. It's a goddamn Frankenstein." Harlan calmly wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek and looked William dead in the eye. "Class rules, William. You know them as well as I do. It's the unlimited heavyweight division. The only restriction is the weight limit on the scale, and he weighed in under the cap. He made a clean hook. He stayed within the boundaries, and he pulled it 300 feet. It's a legal run. I demand a tear down," William roared, spittle flying from his lips. "I'm not paying out a dime to this cheating old hack. You're not doing anything," a new voice boomed. Tom Higgins, the announcer, had descended from the booth, holding the microphone in one hand and the heavy-banded stack of William's cash in the other. He handed the brick of $100 bills to Silas, who had just climbed down from the tractor. Next to the cash, he placed Silas's uncashed cashier's check. "The wager was public, William," Tom said, his voice hard. "You set the terms, you added the weight. Now you've got one piece of business left to do. The microphone is yours." The crowd, sensing the impending climax, suddenly quieted down. 3,000 pairs of eyes burned into the dealership owner. William looked at the microphone as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. His empire was built on intimidation and the illusion of invincibility. This old man hadn't just beaten his tractor. He had shattered that illusion in front of the entire county. Trembling with rage, William snatched the microphone. He stared at the dirt, unable to meet the eyes of the men and women he had bullied for years. "Abernathy Equipment is not the undisputed king of this county." He mumbled quickly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He practically threw the microphone back at Tom and turned to storm away. "Hold on, William." Silas's quiet, steady voice stopped him in his tracks. "We aren't quite finished." Silas walked over to the announcer's table. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired, but his eyes held a steel resolve that pinned William in place. "You called me a fool for betting the farm on an $800 piece of scrap," Silas said, projecting his voice so the front rows could hear him perfectly. "You thought this was about pride. You thought I spent 4 months breaking my back in a machine shed just to prove my wrench turned better than your checkbook. But you don't know the first thing about the people in this county." Silas turned toward the crowd and gestured to a young man standing near the front of the bleachers. "Come on down here, Tommy." Tommy Wilson, the 22-year-old grandson of the late Nora Wilson, nervously hopped over the chain-link fence and walked onto the dirt track. He looked at Silas, then at the towering, cooling Farmall awe written across his face. "When Nora passed away," Silas continued, turning his gaze back to William, "she left the last 50 acres of her family's land to Tommy here. But you already held a predatory lien on that dirt from a seed loan you forced on Nora 5 years ago. You've been squeezing this boy dry, waiting for him to miss a payment so you could foreclose on Monday morning and expand your showroom." William's face went pale. The crowd began to murmur, the low rumble of collective anger rippling through the bleachers. "The balance on that lien is $18,500, Silas said. He looked down at the brick of William's cash, peeled off 15 $100 bills, and shoved them into his own pocket to cover his engine parts. Then he handed the remaining $8,500 in cash, along with his own $10,000 cashier's check, directly to Tommy Wilson. "Tommy," Silas said gently, "I believe you have a debt to settle with Mr. Abernathy." The boy's hands shook as he took the money. He walked up to William, who looked as though he might physically be sick. Tommy shoved the cash and the check into William's chest. "Debt paid in full, Mr. Abernathy. My family's land is no longer for sale." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, realizing the full scope of Silas Miller's masterpiece. Silas hadn't just humiliated William mechanically. He had used William's own arrogance and his own prize money to save a neighbor's farm from his greedy clutches. The very tractor Nora Wilson, his husband, had bought brand new in 1948, had been resurrected from the mud to save the land it used to plow. William Abernathy clutched the money, looking at the rusted, battered Majestic Farmall M. He had nothing left to say. Without another word, he turned and walked off into the darkness, leaving his factory-tuned green monster sitting abandoned on the dirt. Silas tipped his worn Stetson to the cheering crowd, patted the crumpled, oxidized hood of the old red tractor, and smiled. The ghost had done its job. It was time to go home. If you loved this incredible underdog story of a scrapyard ghost taking down a corporate giant, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this video with your friends who appreciate real horsepower and hard work. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another epic tale from the dirt tracks. Tell us in the comments what you thought of Silas's genius engineering build.